Welcome to the History Maps podcast. The mission of this deep dive is to explore the history of Chechnya, part of the Caucasian History series, and to synthesize centuries of political, social, cultural, religious, military, and economic history from the provided sources into a comprehensive narrative just for you. We are looking at a society with no kings, no royal dynasties, no police force, and no standing army, yet it manages to survive for thousands of years in one of the most unforgiving mountain ranges on Earth. So we have to ask, how do you prevent absolute anarchy when everyone is armed, deeply protective of their honor, and surrounded by expanding empires? The answer lies in the ancient, unwritten laws of the North Caucasus. We are going to cover an immense scope of time today, running from the Paleolithic era and the ancient mountain tribes, straight through the Mongol invasions, the Caucasian War, and right up into the modern Chechen-Russian conflicts.
Right, and when you look at that vast expanse of time, a central theme immediately emerges from the sources. That theme is that Chechen history is fundamentally irreversibly shaped by its geography.
The mountains themselves.
Exactly. The Caucasus Mountains are the undeniable protagonist here. They acted as this formidable barrier to outsiders, a literal wall of stone dividing continents. But simultaneously, they served as an unparalleled preserver for the people living within them.
Because the terrain is just so rugged.
Yeah, that highly isolated terrain meant deeply resilient and unique social structures were able to form and, critically, to survive millennia of intense external pressures that wiped out countless other cultures.
So we have to unpack this from the very beginning. To understand how this society functioned, we need to know how it started. When we talk about the deep roots of this region, how far back does human habitation in these mountains actually go? Because the sources point to a timeline far older than most people would guess.
We are going back to the Middle Paleolithic era. The archaeological evidence for the northeastern Caucasus gives us a very clear, tangible picture of early human activity. Specifically, there's a prominent site called Mukai III.
Okay.
And excavations there have revealed stone tools that were created using what is known as the level-law technique.
Let me stop you there, because that term, the level-law technique, comes up a lot in the sources, but it's often just listed as a bullet point. What does that actually mean? Like, if you were standing there watching an early human make one of these tools, what is the actual mechanism?
Right. It is a massive cognitive leap. Before this technique, early humans would essentially just take a rock and smash it with another rock until they got a sharp edge.
Just kind of haphazardly.
Yeah, very haphazard. The level-law technique, however, requires foresight. It requires geometric planning. The toolmaker takes a core stone, usually flint, and carefully chips away the edges to shape it like a turtle shell.
So they're preparing the core first.
Exactly. Then, with one final, precise strike to the top, they detach a large, perfectly shaped flake that is already sharp on all sides. It indicates that the maker could visualize the final product before they even made the first strike.
That is a huge shift in thinking.
It really is. And the findings of these specific tools at Mukai, I point to highly adapted seasonal hunter-gatherer campsites. These early humans were exploiting the local fauna and flora based on the changing seasons, moving up and down the mountain elevations to follow the game.
So you have these highly adaptable, seasonal hunter-gatherer groups mastering their stone tools. But, a seasonal camp is a far cry from a civilization. What is the catalyst for them transitioning into settled communities?
The catalyst is technology, specifically the mastery of heat and earth. If we move forward to the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age, so we are talking about the period roughly around 4000 to 3000 BCE, we see the profound influence of the Kura-Araxes culture spreading into the region.
Okay, and what characterizes them?
This culture was marked by very distinct red and black burnished pottery.
And burnishing isn't just about making it look nice, right? There's a mechanical purpose to that process.
Absolutely. Burnishing involves rubbing the clay with a smooth stone before it is fired. This compresses the surface, making the pottery significantly more watertight and durable.
Which is vital for surviving the mountain winters.
Exactly. It allows for better storage of grains and liquids. But the most significant shift during the Kura-Araxes period is the introduction of early metallurgy. The transition from stone to copperworking completely changes the dynamic of these early societies.
How so?
It facilitates the building of more permanent fortified settlements. The economy shifts from purely hunting and gathering to an integrated system of agriculture combined with animal husbandry. They are tethering themselves to the land in a new way.
And that technological shift sets the foundation for a much more complex society, which leads us directly into the Koben culture. This culture ran roughly from 1100 to 400 BCE. The archaeological findings at the Chechen yurt site are incredibly revealing here.
Yeah, we aren't just looking at basic camps or simple clay pots anymore.
Right, the sources detail permanent dwellings, actual cobble bridges built over mountain streams, and stone grain grinders. They were actively, intentionally cultivating crops like wheat, rye, and barley.
The Coban culture represents a highly advanced stage of development for the region. Their metallurgy is particularly notable. They weren't just working with basic copper, they were working with arsenic alloys to create bronze.
Wait, adding arsenic to copper sounds incredibly dangerous for the Smiths. Why would they use that specific combination?
It was incredibly dangerous. The toxic fumes from smelting arsenic bronze likely caused severe health issues for the metal workers. But the mechanical payoff was significant.
Because it makes it harder.
Right. Adding arsenic to copper lowers the melting point, making it easier to cast into complex molds, and the resulting bronze is significantly harder and holds a sharper edge than pure copper. The Coban Smiths used this alloy to create high-quality weapons, intricate horse gear, and elaborate cult objects.
So they have superior tools and mobility.
Exactly. This level of technological sophistication allowed them to master a semi-nomadic lifestyle. It was a system of transhumance.
Which means they were moving their herds strategically, right? Based on the seasons.
That's it. Transhumance involves moving livestock, sheep, goats, cattle up to the lush, high mountain pastures in the summer, and then bringing them back down into the protected lower valleys during the brutal winter months. It maximizes the agricultural yield of a very vertical, challenging landscape.
That makes total sense.
But, importantly, this mastery of metallurgy, horses, and mobility also facilitated a culture of raiding. Raiding became a significant aspect of their social and economic structure.
Because when you have superior weapons and horses, taking resources from neighboring groups becomes a viable economic strategy.
Precisely.
But, if they were mastering bronze metallurgy, building cobble bridges, and utilizing cavalry mobility, it sounds like they had the perfect recipe for forming a standing army or a centralized early empire. But the sources indicate the exact opposite happened.
Yeah, you might assume that technological superiority leads straight to centralization. But in the Caucasus, the geography actively resists empire building.
The mountains again.
Always the mountains. The deep gorges and isolated valleys meant that power remained decentralized. Instead of forming a massive state, that mobility and metalwork fueled a culture of fierce independence among disparate localized groups.
This brings up one of the most heavily debated questions in the sources, and it is something we need to look at closely. Where did these people originally come from? Did the ancestors of the Chechens, the Vainakh peoples, migrate from the south?
That was a long-held theory.
Right. For a long time, there was this idea that they might be related to the ancient Hurrian and Urartian peoples of Mesopotamia. The thought was that they marched up into the mountains from the cradle of civilization. Or did they develop entirely locally in the Caucasus?
This is a crucial question for understanding their identity, and modern science has provided a significant amount of clarity. When you synthesize the linguistic and genetic evidence provided in the sources, the southern migration theory loses a considerable amount of ground. The Y chromosome data is very telling in this regard.
Let me push back on that for a second to ensure we are being clear. How do a couple of alphanumeric codes on a Y chromosome prove that an entire population didn't march up from Mesopotamia? How does that biological tracking actually work?
It works like a biological clock. The Y chromosome is passed down from father to son, largely unchanged, except for very occasional random mutations.
Okay.
When a specific mutation occurs, it acts as a permanent marker for all of that man's male descendants. Geneticists call these lineages haplogroups. By looking at the frequency and diversity of specific haplogroups in a modern population, scientists can trace back the timeline and geographic origin of their ancestors.
So what do the sources say about the Vainakh people?
They highlight the overwhelming presence of haplogroups J2M67 and J1M267.
And what do those specific markers tell us about their timeline?
They point to a deeply consensus meaning indigenous development. The genetic footprint of these specific markers shows an expansion that occurred directly within the Caucasus region around 6,000 years ago.
Wow. Or I should say that is significant, 6,000 years.
It is. The diversity of these lineages is highest in the mountains themselves, which indicates they have been there for a very, very long time. It largely refutes the theory of a massive wholesale migration from Mesopotamia or the south.
So they didn't pack up and march from the south. They were already there, developing their culture inside those mountain valleys.
Precisely. While there was certainly trade, minor cultural exchange, and perhaps small bands moving back and forth with regions to the south, the core ethnogenesis, the birth of the Vainakh people as a distinct entity, happened right there in the North Caucasus.
And that imposing geography didn't just isolate them from the empires of the outside world, it also created internal distinctions very early on, right?
Yeah, we see a clear linguistic and cultural division emerge between the Vainakh, who were the highlanders living in the deep, inaccessible mountain gorges, and the Nak, the lowlanders who settled the wider foothill river valleys.
That division makes total sense when you consider the terrain. The Highlanders, the Vainakh, became intensely independent and isolated because their environment demanded it. The lowlanders, the Nak, had more interaction with the vast steppe cultures to the north, dealing with nomads and traders. It's a perfect example of geography dictating culture.
Absolutely.
Now, before monotheism reached these mountains, these ancient people developed a rich, highly complex worldview to explain their environment. I want to spend some time looking into the Vainakh mythology because it paints a vivid picture of how they understood their place in the universe.
The ancient Nak cosmology is deeply layered. At the top of their pantheon, you have the supreme creator god, Dela. According to their belief system, Dela created the earth over the course of 3 years.
Okay.
And in a really striking cosmological image, the earth was believed to rest upon gigantic bull horns.
That is a powerful image. I mean, a bull is an animal vital to their agrarian survival, so elevating it to the creature that literally supports the world shows how their daily reality informed their theology. But what I find even more compelling in the sources is their concept of the underworld.
Right. Dili Melki.
Yes. It was ruled by the deity Ishtar Dila. The way they viewed the transition between the upper world and the underworld is quite beautiful. It's almost like watching the setting sun. The sun dips below the horizon in the evening, and instead of disappearing, it journeys into a mirror world to provide light for the dead.
That is the exact cosmological function. They believed the sun physically traveled into Dili Melki at night to illuminate the underworld, and then returned to the upper world in the morning. But what makes the Vainakh underworld so remarkably distinct from many other ancient mythologies is its moral character.
How so?
Well, according to the myths, the underworld took 7 years to create. That is more than twice as long as the 3 years it took to create the earth. Because of that extra time and care, the underworld was actually considered morally superior to the upper world.
That is a significant departure from how we usually conceptualize an underworld. Usually it's a place of gloom or punishment. But here, the sources indicate it had better social structures and a deeper, more refined sense of justice.
It was seen as a perfected reflection of the living world. Furthermore, there was no concept of post-mortem judgment. It wasn't a place of punishment for sinners. It was simply a continuation of existence in a refined, parallel realm. The dead continued to farm, to work, to exist, just under a different set of rules.
And their relationship with the natural elements in the upper world was highly ritualized, too. They had a major sun festival held on December 25th to honor Delamalk, the sun god.
Which aligns with the winter solstice, a critical time for agrarian societies hoping for the return of longer days.
Right. But the element that really stands out in the sources is the significance of tree worship. Specifically, the pear tree held a central, sacred role in Vainakh agrarian and funeral cults.
Yeah, the animistic elements of their faith were deeply tied to the local flora. Trees were seen as living entities, the abodes of powerful spirits. The pear tree in particular was the focal point of numerous rituals. If you cut down a pear tree, it was considered a severe offense, almost akin to a crime against a person.
That profound connection to the physical environment extended directly into how they handled death and the transition to that mirror world of Dili Melki.
Exactly, the funerary practices. The sources describe these towns of the dead located on the outskirts of their villages. They didn't bury their dead in the ground in the way we might typically picture. The architecture of death was very specific.
So what did it look like?
They built stone crypts, often above ground or semi-subterranean, with distinctive stepped roofs. Inside these crypts, they built stone shelves. They placed the deceased on these shelves, fully dressed in their finest garments, alongside their weapons, jewelry, and sometimes food offerings.
So it was a very tangible, physical connection to the ancestors. You could literally walk into the crypt and see generations of your family resting there.
It reinforces the idea that the dead weren't gone. They had just transitioned to that parallel realm. And alongside these funerary cults, there was a broad societal acceptance of magic users.
Right. The sources mention that witches, warlocks, and entities like jinns were fully integrated into their daily understanding of the world. Rituals frequently involved the sacrifice of domestic animals, specifically roosters and hens, to appease local spirits, seek favor for the harvest, or ward off illness.
It was a highly localized, deeply spiritual existence that bound the isolated mountain communities together.
And that binding is the crucial point. Because in a challenging environment, shared rituals and a shared understanding of the universe create social cohesion. But religion alone wasn't enough to govern them.
No, it wasn't.
Which brings up the most pressing question of this entire deep dive. We are looking at a society with no centralized state. There is no king, no feudal lord, no royal dynasty collecting taxes or enforcing laws. How does a society like that maintain order?
It's a great question.
Right. I mean, how do they prevent absolute chaos when neighboring valleys might be competing for the same limited resources? That question transitions us directly into the intricate foundational clan structure of Chechnya.
To understand anything about Chechen history, from the Bronze Age to the modern conflicts, you have to understand the clan structure. It is the absolute bedrock of their society.
Right.
Let's break down this hierarchy from the bottom up, because it is highly structured.
Okay, where does it start?
The foundational unit is the Sa, which translates directly to the house. This is the extended family, usually spanning a few generations living together under one roof or in a small cluster of dwellings. Above the Sa is the Gar, which is a branch of closely related families who know their direct ancestral links.
And above the Gar is the central pillar of the society, the type.
Yes, the type is the clan. It is a larger group claiming descent from a common ancestor, often sharing a specific geographic origin or a foundational myth. And finally, at the highest level, you have the Tukum.
And a Tukum is essentially a political and military union of several types, correct?
Exactly. It is based on blood lineage like the type, but rather on regional alliances, formed to solve broader economic issues or to defend against external military threats.
And these types have very strict, unbreakable rules. For instance, the sources emphasize that they are strictly exogamous. You're required to marry outside of your own type. You cannot marry someone from your own clan. Why was that rule so rigid?
Exogamy serves a dual purpose. Biologically, it prevents inbreeding in highly isolated mountain valleys. Socially and politically, it forces alliances. When you marry outside your type, you weave a complex web of kinship and mutual obligation across different clans.
So it ensures the distinct groups remain interconnected.
Yes, and the system was dynamic. The sources note that the number of types grew significantly. In the early periods, there might have been roughly 30 types, but by the mid-19th century, that number had grown to around 150.
So they were splitting off.
Right. As families grew too large or resources became scarce, a Gar might branch off, move to a new valley, and eventually establish its own distinct clan identity as a new type.
But despite that fluidity, governance remained highly structured, just not in a feudal sense. If there is no king, who makes the decisions?
Governance was handled entirely by elders. The supreme body was the Mikakel, which translates to the State Council of Elders. Representatives from the various types would gather, often high in the mountains at specific synchro geographic locations, to form this council.
And what were they responsible for?
They were responsible for the most critical decisions affecting the wider community.
So we are talking about issues of war and peace.
Exactly. The Mekakel would declare war, negotiate peace treaties with neighboring peoples, set the specific timing for the harvest to ensure everyone worked together, and resolve major inter-clan disputes that threatened to spiral out of control.
When you contrast this egalitarian democratic structure with the strict feudal dynasties and serfdom seen in other parts of the world, particularly in neighboring imperial Russia or the Georgian kingdoms to the south, it highlights a fundamentally different social evolution. They actively rejected the concept of one man ruling over another.
They did. And at the very core of that social evolution, that rejection of feudalism, is the concept of Nokchala, the Chechen character. And a massive part of Nokchala is the concept of Ya.
The sources describe Ya as a healthy competition, this intense, innate drive to be better than your peers. How does Ya practically shape the character of a person growing up in a stateless society?
Ya is the internal engine of the culture. It means a child is raised from birth with the expectation that they must never, under any circumstances, be worse than their peers in bravery, generosity, or skill.
So it's a constant pressure.
Yeah, if your neighbor builds a strong stone tower, Ya dictates that you must strive to build one just as strong or better. If your peer shows immense hospitality to a stranger, you must be even more generous. But simultaneously, the rules of Nokchala dictate that you must never use your strength or success to oppress the weak or the less fortunate.
It creates a society constantly striving for honor and excellence, rather than accumulating power to subjugate others.
Exactly.
But that internal drive has to be regulated, otherwise it just turns into chaotic one-upmanship. That external regulation is provided by a dot. A dot is the unwritten customary law of the Caucasus. It is the social glue that holds everything together.
Yes, a dot is the comprehensive legal framework.
The sources detail how it emphasizes absolute hospitality, chivalry, and a profound, unquestioning respect for elders.
And we should contrast Edat with an older concept mentioned in the sources, Lamkirst. Lamkirst was the older, much harsher pagan law. Over centuries, as the society matured, Edat evolved as a more refined, comprehensive moral and legal code.
What are some of the specific rules of Adat that show this refinement?
Well, Edat strictly forbids harming women, children, and the elderly during any conflict. It regulates behavior in the home, dictating how a guest must be treated. A guest is considered sacred, and a host must protect them with their own life.
So it governs public behavior, too.
Yes, it regulates behavior in the public square, how you speak to an elder, how you conduct trade. It was the absolute legal framework that allowed these fiercely independent competitive clans to coexist without a state apparatus, police force, or prisons to enforce the laws.
But inevitably, human nature dictates that conflicts will happen. Property is stolen, insults are thrown, violence occurs. In a society without police to arrest a suspect or prisons to hold them, justice takes a vastly different form. We have to impartially unpack the mechanics of the blood feud.
It is a difficult concept for modern listeners.
Right. To modern ears, it sounds brutal and chaotic. But we need to explain how this ancient mechanism actually functioned to prevent anarchy, rather than cause it.
It is entirely counterintuitive to a modern Western legal mind. But the blood feud was a highly regulated, deeply effective deterrent. Under Adat, a crime against an individual was not viewed as an isolated incident. It was a crime against their entire type.
So it escalates immediately to the group level?
Exactly. If someone was murdered, the victim's family had the right and the sacred obligation to seek blood revenge against the perpetrator's family.
But there were strict rules governing this vengeance. As you mentioned, women, children, and the elderly were strictly excluded from being targeted. You couldn't just attack anyone.
No, it was very specific.
And there are fascinating social mechanisms built into Ad to diffuse conflict before it turns lethal. The sources give a great example regarding kidnapping. If a man kidnaps a woman for marriage, which was an older, aggressive custom, but the woman rejects him, Adat doesn't necessarily demand he be killed.
Right, it offers an alternative.
Instead, it forces a social humiliation and obligation. The rejected kidnapper is forced to become a matchmaker for her, tasked with finding someone she actually loves and wants to marry. It diffuses the violence through forced social obligation. So to bring it back to the blood feud, how does a system built on vengeance actually aim to create stability?
If you want a modern analogy to understand the mechanics, think about the Cold War doctrine of mutually assured destruction. You don't launch a nuclear weapon because you know the enemy will launch one back and your entire country will be destroyed.
So it's deterrence.
Yes. The blood feud operates on a localized version of that exact principle. It creates stability through the mechanism of collective responsibility.
So if you commit a crime, you aren't just ruining your own life.
Exactly. If you commit murder, you are effectively signing a death warrant for your brothers, your father, your cousins. The fear of bringing absolute ruin and generations of retaliatory violence down upon your entire extended family acts as a severe, overriding deterrent to committing a crime in the first place.
That makes a lot of sense.
Before you strike someone, you know that your family will pay the price. In a stateless society with no police force, the absolute certainty of severe collective retribution maintains a tense but highly effective equilibrium. People treat each other with extreme courtesy because the cost of an insult or an injury is simply too high.
Okay, so you have this stable, highly isolated mountain society governed by a dot, driven by Ya, and organized by the type system. They have maintained this equilibrium for centuries, but eventually isolation breaks down. They were forced to face the massive, expanding empires of the medieval world.
That brings us to the Kingdom of Alania and their early contacts with outsiders.
Tell us about Alania.
The Kingdom of Alania was a major political and military power in the region for the 9th to the 13th centuries. It was a multi-ethnic kingdom that encompassed the northern plains and the foothills of the Caucasus. Its capital was the heavily fortified city of Magas.
And they were powerful because of trade, right?
Yet the Alans were formidable because they controlled the vital, lucrative trade routes passing through the Caucasus, connecting the steppe to the southern empires.
And during this period, we see the first major external religious influences trying to penetrate the mountains. In the early 10th century, Alania was Christianized by Byzantine missionaries. We also see Georgian Orthodox missionaries pushing up from the south, deep into the mountain gorges during this period.
Right. The sources note this resulted in the brief Christianization of some Vainakh types. You can still find ruins of ancient Christian chapels high in the Chechen mountains.
So there was a blending of beliefs.
Yes, there was a period of religious syncretism where elements of Christianity blended with their ancient pagan beliefs. But what is most crucial about the Alania period is how decentralized it remained, despite being a kingdom.
There is a really telling vignette in the sources from a Hungarian monk named Friar Julian. In 1236, he traveled through Alania and observed what he considered an entirely anarchic state. He wrote in his accounts that there were, quote, as many princes as villages, leader against leader.
It's a great observation.
It shows that even within this broader kingdom, the decentralized, fiercely independent, clan-based nature of the Caucasus was highly prevalent. The local chiefs did not bow easily to a central king.
And that extreme fragmentation, while excellent for local independence, became a fatal weakness when an existential threat arrived. And that threat was the greatest military machine of the medieval world, the Mongol Empire.
The initial contact happened in the 1220s. Genghis Khan's greatest generals, Jabi and Subutai, passed through the region on a massive scouting and raiding expedition. But the true devastating onslaught came in 1237, directed by Mongke Khan.
The Mongols were a force unlike anything the Caucasus had ever seen. They were highly organized, utilizing massive numbers of heavy and light cavalry and, most importantly, advanced siege engineering acquired from their conquests in China and Persia.
The sources detail the siege of the Alan capital Magas. It took place over the brutal winter of 1239 to 1240. The Mongols utilized devastating scorched earth tactics. They didn't just defeat armies, they eradicated infrastructure.
They completely destroyed the lowland Vainakh states, specifically the polities known as Durdzuketi and Simsir.
But I have to ask, how does a mountain society survive the greatest cavalry army in history? I mean, the Mongols conquered from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Why didn't they wipe out the Vainakh completely?
Because the Mongol military machine, heavily reliant on vast herds of horses and open field maneuvers, loses its primary advantage in extreme vertical terrain.
So the mountains saved them again?
Yes, but the devastation in the plains and the foothills was near total. The Vainakh who survived there were forced into a humiliating tributary relationship with the Golden Horde, which was the western division of the Mongol Empire. They had to pay heavy tribute in livestock and grain. But a significant portion of the population did not submit.
They retreated.
Yes. They moved higher and deeper into the most inaccessible, unforgiving parts of the mountains above the snow line, where Mongol cavalry simply could not operate effectively. And this period of retreat fundamentally changed their architecture and their society.
This is the period where they began building those iconic, towering, defensive stone structures that still dot the landscape today.
Let's talk about those towers, because they are an architectural marvel. We aren't talking about simple stone huts.
Not at all. We are talking about structures that are 4 to 5 stories high, built with incredibly precise dry stone masonry.
Meaning no mortar was used.
Exactly, no mortar. The stones were cut to interlock perfectly. The base was broad, tapering up to a pyramidal roof. The ground floor was for livestock. The second floor, accessible only by a retractable wooden ladder, was the living quarters.
And the top floors.
The upper floors were for defense, complete with machicolations, overhanging stone balconies with holes to drop rocks or boiling liquids on attackers. A single extended family, a Tsa, could lock themselves inside one of these towers with provisions and hold out against a siege for months. But the Mongol presence wasn't the end of the devastation. Just as the region was beginning to recover in the late 14th century, around 1395, another conqueror arrived. The Turco-Mongol warlord Timur, also known as Tamerlane, launched massive punitive expeditions into the region.
Timur's campaigns were characterized by unprecedented brutality. He completely eradicated what was left of the Simsir polity in the plains. His armies burned the forests, destroyed the crops, and hunted refugees into the gorges.
So, subjected to back-to-back apocalypses, the Vainakh relied entirely on the type system to survive this massive bottleneck in their population. They endured in the high peaks, carving out agricultural terraces on sheer cliff faces just to grow enough grain to survive.
It was a very bleak period.
They waited in the stone towers for the empires below to eventually weaken so they could begin the slow process of repopulating the plains.
That multi-generational retreat solidified the type system as the absolute, unquestionable core of their survival. It proved to them, through harsh experience, that when empires fall and the world seemingly ends, the state will not save you. The clan is the only thing that keeps you alive.
And as they begin this post-Mongol and post-Timur recovery, as they start moving back down into the foothill plains and interacting with Turkic nomads in the 16th and 17th centuries, we see a profound cultural shift taking place. This is the arrival of Islam.
Yes. Starting in the 16th century, we see the gradual, steady spread of Sunni Islam into the region. Specifically, they adopted the Shafi madhab, which is one of the 4 schools of Islamic jurisprudence.
And the Sufi orders as well, right?
Correct. Alongside the formal, legalistic side of Islam, we see the profound, transformative influence of the Sufi tariqats, or mystic orders.
The sources specifically mention the Naqshbandi and later the Qadiri orders. But a question arises here. You have a fiercely independent, clan-based society that has relied on its own pagan traditions and unwritten adat for millennia. Why would they adopt a highly structured foreign religion with a written legal code like Sharia?
It is a phenomenal sociological shift, and the answer lies in utility and survival. Islam didn't replace the Taik system. The clans were far too entrenched for that. Instead, Islam served as a new overarching cementing force.
A shared vocabulary.
Exactly. Before Islam, if 2 types had a dispute, they relied on local elders and adat. But as they moved down into the plains and faced larger external threats, they needed a way to unify disparate clans who might have historically feuded with each other.
So Islam provided that framework.
Yes, it provided a universal religious and political vocabulary. It provided a framework for unity that superseded clan lines without demanding the dismantling of the clans themselves.
So you have these fiercely independent clans, now bound by a shared Islamic framework, but still historically divided by their types. The only thing that could ever force them to actually fight as one single unified army would be an existential threat so massive that they had no choice.
And in the late 1700s, that threat arrives.
Right, the expanding Russian Empire. And the man who figures out how to fuse these clans together to face it is Sheikh Mansour.
Sheikh Mansour is an absolute watershed figure in Chechen history. To understand his impact, you have to look at his origins. He was born with the name Ushirma in the village of Aldi around 1760.
And he wasn't royalty?
Not at all. He comes from an incredibly humble background. He was a poor shepherd who tended his neighbor's flocks. He had no formal aristocratic lineage, no immense wealth.
But he transforms from a humble shepherd into this immensely powerful orator, a spiritual leader, and a military commander.
He experienced a profound spiritual awakening and began preaching a strict adherence to Islam, urging the mountaineers to abandon their internal blood feuds, stop smoking tobacco, and unify.
And his military strategy.
His grand strategy was something entirely new for the region. He recognized the encroaching existential threat of the Russian Empire, which was building forts along the northern borders. His vision was to unite all the disparate, often feuding mountaineers of the North Caucasus, the Chechens, the Dagestanis, the Circassians, under the singular unifying banner of Islam to mount a massive, coordinated resistance.
He led the first major organized resistance starting in 1785. The sources detail how he scored some intense initial victories, wiping out a Russian brigade sent to capture him at his home village of Aldi.
The success electrified the Caucasus, and thousands flocked to his banner.
But ultimately, the logistics and manpower of the Russian military machine were simply too vast.
The Russian Empire possessed unlimited artillery, disciplined infantry, and deep supply lines. The sources trace Mansour's final, desperate battles as the Russian army pushed him back. After those initial successes, he was forced to retreat, fleeing west out of Chechnya and into Circassia.
He fought a major engagement on the Europe River in September 1787. He was constantly on the move, trying to rally different tribes. Eventually, he allied with the Ottoman Empire, which was also fighting Russia.
But during the brutal Russian siege of the Ottoman fortress of Anapa in 1791, the fortress fell and Sheikh Mansour was captured.
And that was the end for him.
Yes. He was taken in chains to St. Petersburg, interrogated by the imperial authorities, and ultimately died in the notorious Schlüsselburg fortress in 1794. The man who tried to unite the mountains died in a damp imperial dungeon.
But his military defeat did not end his legacy. Far from it. Sheikh Mansour laid the exact blueprint for all future Caucasian resistance.
He really did.
He demonstrated for the first time that the decentralized, hyper-independent mountain clans could be temporarily fused together into a formidable army by a charismatic leader utilizing Islamic rhetoric to fight a common imperial enemy.
And that blueprint was put into action almost immediately, because Mansour's resistance was just the prelude. It was the opening skirmish of a much larger, multi-generational conflict that would define the region, the Caucasian War.
To understand the Caucasian War, which dragged on from 1817 to 1864, we have to look at the strategic imperatives of the Russian Empire. The Tsars weren't just expanding for the sake of it. There was a geopolitical necessity driving them into the mountains.
Correct. The geopolitical map changed drastically following Russia's annexation of the Kingdom of Georgia in 1801. Georgia is located south of the Caucasus Mountains.
So Russia now held vital territory south of the range.
Yes, but the massive, rugged mountains sitting between Russia proper and their new Georgian territory were controlled by independent, fiercely hostile tribes, securing the communication and supply lines. Specifically, the Georgian military road that cut right through the mountains became an absolute existential necessity for the Russian Empire.
They could not supply or defend Georgia if the mountain tribes could cut the road at will.
Exactly. That strategic requirement led directly to the brutal, grinding, decades-long campaign of the Caucasian War.
The resistance to this massive Russian expansion coalesced into what became known as the Caucasian Imamate. This state lasted from 1829 to 1859. It was a military theocratic state that achieved what Sheikh Mansour had dreamed of. It managed to unify massive swaths of Dagestan and Chechnya under a single command structure.
And the leadership of the Imamate passed through three imams. First was Ghazi Muhammad, then Hamzat Bek, and finally, the most famous and successful of them all, Imam Shamil.
Imam Shamil was a figure of legendary status, a true military and political genius. He recognized that to fight a modern empire, he needed a state. He formalized the structure of the imamate, creating a standing army, an elite guard, and a system of taxation.
Crucially, he enforced strict Islamic law, Sharia, to override the traditional adat necessary to maintain unity and discipline. If a clan tried to prioritize their chief over the war effort, Shamil dealt with them harshly.
But the core question here is tactical. You have a coalition of mountain clans armed mostly with traditional muskets, swords, and daggers. They are facing the massive modern Russian Imperial Army, equipped with heavy artillery, standardized rifles, and professional officers. How on earth did Shamil hold them off for 30 years?
They leveraged their only major advantage, which was the extreme terrain. Shamil and his followers, known as Murids, perfected mountain guerrilla warfare. They completely refused to fight pitched battles on open ground where Russian artillery and cavalry would absolutely decimate them.
So what does a Murid ambush actually look like?
It requires immense patience and geographic mastery. The Chechen fighters would retreat into the dense, ancient beech forests and the high, impassable mountain gorges. The Russian generals, desperate for a decisive victory, would order their columns deep into the wilderness to pursue them.
And the Murids would just let them walk in.
They would let them enter. They would stretch the Russian supply lines to the breaking point. Then, once the Russian column was trapped in a narrow ravine, the Murids would strike. They would fell massive trees behind and in front of the Russian troops, trapping them.
And then fire down on them.
Yes, they would execute devastating, coordinated ambushes from the high ground, firing down into the trapped soldiers before melting back into the forest. It was a brutal war of attrition that exhausted the Russian military, costing the empire immense amounts of blood and treasure.
But eventually, even the mountains, even the genius of Shamil, weren't enough. The Russian military adapted their strategy. They stopped trying to win quick victories and implemented a slow, methodical strangulation of the region.
Under generals like Yermolov and later Baryatinsky, the Russians employed systematic, devastating tactics. They literally began cutting down the ancient forests to remove the Murids' cover.
They deforested the area.
Yes, and they built interlocking lines of stone forts to choke off the highlands, cutting the highlanders off from the fertile lowland pastures they needed to survive the winter. They burned crops and destroyed villages to starve the resistance.
This methodical strangulation led to the eventual collapse of the imamate. Facing starvation and overwhelming numbers, Imam Shamil finally surrendered in 1859 at the Olive Gunib. This surrender marked the end of the organized resistance and the full incorporation of Chechnya into the Russian Empire.
The physical resistance, the standing army of the Imamate, was broken. But the cultural resistance, the absolute reliance on the type system, the deep-seated Islamic faith, and the intensely ingrained sense of "ya" didn't vanish. It simply retreated back into the domestic sphere.
The people went back to their villages, kept their heads down, and waited for the next historical shift.
And that waiting period brings us into the 20th century. We transition from the collapse of imperial Russia during the revolution into the era of the Soviet Union. This era contains an event that is so profound, so devastating, that it permanently scarred the Chechen collective memory. Everything that happens in the modern era is viewed through the lens of this trauma.
Let's talk about the early Soviet period first. Initially, the Bolsheviks promised autonomy, but that quickly shifted into aggressive agricultural collectivization. For a society built on independent family landholdings and fierce clan autonomy, forcing everyone onto state-run collective farms was viewed as a direct, unacceptable assault on their fundamental way of life.
Naturally, local uprisings erupted across the mountains throughout the 1920s and 30s, which the Soviet state, utilizing the Red Army and the secret police, violently suppressed.
But the defining trauma, the absolute nadir of their history, occurred during the Second World War.
Yes. In February 1944, under the direct, explicit orders of Joseph Stalin and executed by his security chief Lavrentiy Beria, the Soviet state executed the forced deportation of the entire Chechen and Ingush populations.
The numbers here are just awful. We are talking about the mass removal of approximately 500,000 people.
The logistics of this operation were staggering. Over 100,000 Soviet troops were moved into the region under the guise of military exercises. Then, on a single day, the entire population was rounded up at gunpoint, marched to the railheads, and loaded onto unheated cattle cars in the dead of winter.
And they were sent east.
Their destination was the desolate steppes of Central Asia, primarily Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan.
Now, we must examine the pretext used by the Soviet government for this massive ethnic cleansing and then look at the historical reality. The official Soviet justification was that the Chechen population was actively collaborating with Nazi Germany, who were pushing into the Caucasus during the war.
That pretext was an unsubstantiated, fabricated claim used solely to justify the elimination of a historically rebellious population. The historical reality, which must be explicitly and impartially noted based on the sources, is that the German army never even fully penetrated Chechen territory.
Furthermore, at the exact moment their families were being rounded up, their homes seized, and their ancient stone towers blown up by Soviet troops, thousands of Chechen men were actively fighting and dying in the ranks of the Red Army on the Eastern Front.
They were defending the very state that was currently deporting their wives and children.
We have to look at the human cost of this exile because the conditions were horrific and the statistics are staggering. What were the conditions like during transit and upon arrival?
The mortality rates are incredibly grim. It is estimated by historians that between 1/4 and 1/3 of the entire deported population died. They succumbed to typhus and other rampant diseases in the cramped cattle cars.
They were just packed in there.
Yes, and they died of starvation because they were given virtually no rations. And they died of extreme exposure, freezing to death, both during the brutal transit and upon arrival in the harsh, unforgiving environments of the Central Asian steppe. They were essentially dumped in the snow and told to build their own shelters.
They were kept in special settlement camps, stripped of their civil rights, forbidden to travel, and treated as enemies of the state.
It wasn't until the late 1950s, following Stalin's death and Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech, that they were partially rehabilitated and permitted to return to their homeland.
And when they returned, they found their homes occupied by strangers, their mosques destroyed, and their gravestones used to pave roads. That level of multi-generational historical trauma, combined with the deeply ingrained cultural norms of the type and the mechanics of the blood feud we discussed earlier, created a highly combustible psychological environment.
And that brings us to the explosive violence that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991.
As we discuss these modern conflicts, it is crucial that we look at the geopolitical and military actions objectively, focusing on how the historical patterns we've discussed manifested on the modern battlefield. The First Chechen War, spanning from 1994 to 1996, began as a direct Russian military intervention.
The goal was to crush the separatist Ichkeria regime, led by Dzhokhar Dudayev, which had declared independence following the Soviet collapse.
The Russian military leadership in Moscow expected a swift, bloodless victory. They assumed a massive column of tanks driving into the capital would force an immediate surrender.
Instead, it resulted in catastrophic heavy urban combat. The Chechen fighters, many of whom were veterans of the Soviet army themselves, utilized their historical knowledge of guerrilla tactics and adapted them for a modern, ruined, urban environment.
So they took the mountain tactics into the city.
Exactly. The fighting in the capital, Grozny, was reminiscent of Stalingrad. The Chechen combatants formed small, highly mobile anti-armor hunter-killer teams. They would trap Russian armored columns in the narrow city streets, knocking out the lead in rear vehicles, and then methodically destroy the rest from the upper floors of the apartment buildings.
The tactical mismatch resulted in severe Russian defeats, immense casualties on both sides, and ultimately a humiliating withdrawal by Russian forces in 1996, leaving Chechnya with de facto independence.
But the peace didn't last, and the region descended into internal warlordism and economic ruin. The Second Chechen War erupted in 1999 and lasted in its active military phase until roughly 2009.
This war was sparked by incursions of radical Chechen militants into the neighboring Republic of Dagestan and a series of deadly, highly controversial apartment bombings in Russian cities. The Russian military response this time, ordered by newly appointed Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, was fundamentally different and overwhelmingly brutal.
They did not send vulnerable tank columns into the cities this time. They utilized massive, indiscriminate aerial bombing campaigns and heavy artillery barrages to level entire towns before sending in infantry.
The sources note specific instances of extreme violence during these brutal mop-up operations known as zakiska. For example, the event in the suburb of Novi Aldi in February 2000, where Russian riot police executed dozens of civilians during a sweep.
And in analyzing the mobilization of the Chechen resistance during these brutal wars, we have to look at how traditional culture was weaponized. This is where the ancient history meets modern warfare. How did ancient concepts like the blood feud function when you were dealing with helicopters, tanks, and thermobaric weapons?
You have modern weaponry, but the psychological mindset of the fighters is still rooted in the mountains of the Bronze Age. When Russian forces invaded leveled villages and inflicted massive civilian casualties, the traditional Highlanders did not just view this as a standard geopolitical or separatist conflict. They viewed the violence through the ancient, deeply ingrained moral lens of a dat.
The collective responsibility.
Precisely. The Russian military, and the Russian state by extension, were categorized as sworn blood enemies. Therefore, for a Chechen man, taking up arms wasn't just a political choice about independence. Retaliation became a matter of sacred, inescapable family honor.
If your cousin was killed in a bombing, and that demanded that you seek vengeance. This ancient cultural framework heavily fueled both the initial mass mobilization of fighters and the subsequent tragic radicalization of the conflict as it dragged on for years.
Which leads us to the current highly complex political landscape under Ramzan Kadyrov. The wars largely ended, the cities were rebuilt with massive federal subsidies, but the clan system didn't disappear. It simply evolved to fit a modern authoritarian framework.
Sociologists studying the region refer to this current evolution as Type 2. It's a fascinating, if disturbing, mutation of the ancient system. Historically, as we discussed, the type system relied on democratic councils of elders maintaining a delicate balance of power through customary law. No single clan could dominate. Under the current regime, we see the rise of informal patronage networks and strict patrimonialism.
So how does the Kadyrov clan utilize these ancient systems today?
They utilize the deep-seated loyalties of the type system, but they completely subvert its democratic nature. They place loyalists from their own clan or allied clans into all key positions of political, economic, and security power. Furthermore, they actively manipulate ancient customs, including the profound threat of the blood feud.
But not for traditional justice.
No, rather than using the blood feud for traditional justice or to maintain a stateless equilibrium as it was designed, it is utilized as a blunt tool for political coercion. The threat of collective punishment against an entire extended family is used to silence dissent, force public apologies on social media, and consolidate absolute, unquestioned state control.
It's a profound, almost tragic shift in how these ancient social codes are applied. A system designed to prevent tyranny is now used to enforce it.
And if we connect this evolution to the bigger picture, it leaves us with a critical, deeply provocative question to consider. Think about how deeply ingrained cultural codes, like the concept of ya, that relentless burning drive to outdo one's peers, and the strict, unforgiving mechanics of the blood feud can survive for literal millennia.
It really is incredible.
We've traced these exact concepts adapting from maintaining peace in stateless Bronze Age villages, to fueling guerrilla resistance against the czars in the ancient forests, to mobilizing fighters in the ruined, modern, urban combat of Grozny, and now to functioning as heavily manipulated tools for modern political machinations. If culture is truly the bedrock of social action, overriding technology and the state itself, how much of modern geopolitics everywhere is secretly being driven by these ancient unwritten laws?
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.